Hi guys, Anthony and Bob Barker are back again with another build. And so for this one, I told my wife that I'd make her a DJ table and asked her, what she wanted, and this is what she came up with. A little bit bigger than we planned on, but I think it's coming out great, so let's get started on the build. So after some back and forth with the wife on what we wanted to do, this is the design that we ended up coming up with. So after a trip to the lumberyard, we got the materials that we needed, and now it's time to start breaking them down. For this one, this is a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, and I don't like to wrestle it on top of the table, so I just throw some 2x4s down on the ground, measure it out, and then we can get it down to manageable pieces that way. And I am going to be using my track saw, but you don't need a track saw to do this kind of stuff. I was using just those wooden guides that I made for a long time, and they serve the purpose, although the track saw itself actually does work a little bit faster. So the only thing you're really saving yourself is by having the more expensive tool is really some time. And I'm still a little new with this track saw. Like my regular clamps won't fit underneath it because it's so low to the ground. So I was using these ones, but later on I realized I kind of don't really need them because it stays in place pretty darn well as I'm doing it. So I ended up ditching that later. So once I got the chunks to the size that I need, it's all over to the table saw so we can rip them down to the right dimensions. So for this project, we're going to be making 4 separate cabinets, even though it is 5 sections. For the middle cabinet area, we're just basically going to be connecting them with some supports. And for the other 4 sections, we're going to be making 2 of each cabinet type. So we're going to have one with drawers and one with cabinet doors. And so we got those cut down, and now we're just cutting down all the support pieces that we're going to need to putting them together. And there was definitely quite a few since we're doing a lot of cabinets here. So next up, we're going to be putting some slots in there. So I just use that setup block and one of the pieces as a spacer to get it where we need it. And this is going to be parting that's going to hold in the back panel. So since it's just going to be a 1/4 inch, I'm just going to do it in 2 passes with the table saw. So basically I run it through one time and then I move it over just enough to get the correct width. And of course I use this little tester piece just to check on the panel to make sure it's going to fit. And then I can just get all those same pieces and run them through one more time, and then we have a dado groove going through all of those pieces that's going to hold in that back panel. And so we're doing that on some of the supports as well as the plywood pieces. If that doesn't quite make sense, it'll definitely make more sense once we're putting these together. So then we run through and put some pocket hole screws in all of these support pieces, and then we'll be ready to assemble pretty soon. So that's pretty much most of the parts for the first cabinets, but now we still got to rip down for the second set of cabinets. And the supervisor came by to check on me and make sure I'm very focused on this build because we have a very important client and he did not want me to mess it up. So then we got to breaking down these pieces of plywood. Now with these cabinets, for both different types, we're not going to be putting toe kicks on them. Normally I'll do a separate toe kick, but for this one we're not going to have one at all, and that was part of the design that the wife wanted. So for these ones, they're a little bit more shallow, and this is going to be the ones with the cabinet doors, so it's going to be an open cabinet. And I am going to be putting a dado groove in the bottom piece because these will have like the bottom of the cabinet. I'm actually not even bothering putting that in for the ones in the drawers because you're never going to see that area. I'll just do some supports for that. So for this one, same as before, I'm using a support that I already cut out for the spacer because I'm going to have a spacer that goes underneath that bottom panel. So that gives me the proper spacing without having to measure. So we just go ahead and cut out those the grooves for both sides of the cabinet, and of course we're going to be doing this 4 times because we're doing 2 of each type of cabinet. Now we need to cut these support pieces down to the right length. When we did the other cabinet, it was a slightly different length, so I just saved these ones until I had the final length that I knew I wanted. And now that we have that, we can get these cut down to the proper size. And I am definitely enjoying my new miter saw. It's a definite upgrade compared to my prior one. So just like on the other cabinets, we're doing the same thing, cutting a groove in here for the back panel. Just like before, we use one of the supports as a spacer. That way we know it's going to fit perfectly behind it, and then we can run all of these pieces through there. And just like before, we'll move the fence over just a slight bit, and then we'll run it again. So now that we've finally got all the pieces for all 4 cabinets done, we're getting ready for assembly. And for the parts that are going to be hard to hit, we just do a really light sanding. Of course, you don't want to be too aggressive on this plywood because that veneer is really thin, and For the inside, you will see it, so I don't want to go to that. For the outside, it doesn't quite matter so much because that's going to be painted. So now for the glue open assembly, and I do put glue in all of my joints. I don't always show it on these videos because it's kind of boring sometimes watching me do glue over and over, but I just figured I'd mention that here. So that groove, this groove was a little tight, so just to kind of help get it in, I had to get a little tap with a mallet, and then I used my clamps just to make sure it was fully seated in there. And then just to help with the alignment as well, I always like to use these 90-degree positioning clamps. It just keeps everything nice and square, and they're so easy to use. So I put those on each side and just go ahead and tighten them down, and then we can go ahead and flip this around so we can put in the other side. So underneath it, I just use one of the extra supports as a spacer, just because it gets me the right height, and then we can just go ahead and attach this other side. And just like before, we're using some clamps here to make sure it stays nice and seated, and also just to help keep good pressure on it so it's nice and tight while the glue is drying up. And of course, just because my clamp supply isn't where I would like it to be, I had to do those one at a time, but either way, it still gets done. So with that still in the clamps, I decided to put in the top supports here. So I just basically line those up, glue them, clamp them in place, and then just put in some pocket screws. Try to make sure they're as flush as possible. And now this is for the front part where you would normally have, like, a space for a toe kick, but here we're just be doing like a flat panel, and this is going to end up getting covered by the face frame later, so it doesn't really matter, the pocket screws are there. It might be unnecessary, but I figured a little extra support behind it won't hurt anything. Then we can move down to breaking down the 1/4-inch plywood for the back panels. And I use that blue thing from Betterly just to make sure that my two tracks are completely lined up with each other for doing the longer cuts. I forget what it's called, but it's a pretty useful little device there. So once we have those cut down to our sizes, then we can just go ahead and do a very, very light sanding on them, and we can put them into place. And we ran into a bit of a problem here. So as I'm putting it in, it kind of gets stuck. Turns out I was a little sloppy with my dado grooves there, so I let it ride a little bit on me, so it's narrowed. So I had to come back with a chisel there just to kind of help widen it up and clean it up a little bit better, so I can get that panel into it. A little extra work that I could have avoided, but in the end it ended up being okay. It was still a little tighter than I wanted to get this in, so instead of having the cabinet on the ground, I, for some reason, always just jump on top of my table, but we were able to do that, and I could slowly push it into place, just a little bit bowed, so that made it harder too, but with a little extra persuasion, it did go in. And so you can see the groove on the support piece goes down and locks in that back panel. And just like the front piece, you just tie it all together with some pocket hole screws. And then once we have all that done, we'll go ahead and remove the clamp, and then we'll end up turning this thing around. And you'll be able to see why I use the plywood itself as a spacer for the dado groove on the back panel, because you see it with that setback there. These pieces now fit just perfectly in there, and these add for extra support as well as nailers. That way you can screw through those into the wall, or like I'll be doing with the other cabinets, those just add an extra meat there to the back. That way you have something to screw into if you need to put in some extra pieces to hold the cabinet hardware, like I'll be doing for the undermount drawer slides. And just to lock in the rest of it, I usually sink in a few screws from the supports on top to the back ones as well. And what we did with one cabinet, we definitely got to do with the next one. And Bob Barker saw my mistake on the first one, so he came by just to make sure that I did not repeat that. He's watching me closely there, and luckily this time when I put in this back panel, it went in nice and smooth. And once again, I could have been doing this on the ground, but just for some reason always jump on my my bench. So now we're going to be putting the other cabinets together. You notice there's no dado groove for a bottom piece on this one because we're not putting it in. Now these positioning squares aren't really necessary for this, but I just wanted something just to kind of hold it up while I'm putting the pieces together, and these do the job. But there's many other different ways you can do this. So I just got them roughly in place, and I put the support where it's going to end up going. And that kind of held it enough for me to put them together. And so for the front area, you can see I'm going to be putting just in a support right in the very bottom, just like on the first one. And then I'll just put a second support piece right on top of this, which will end up just kind of forming the bottom of the cabinet. And this will give me something for the face frame to connect to, which is definitely necessary on this one. So the next part is putting in this top support on the bottom piece. And what I did here, just to kind of make sure it stays at a 90-degree angle, is I got a couple of the other supports that I'll be using for the top later. And I just set those inside the cabinet. That way I can rest this on them. And then I know that it stays at a complete 90-degree angle there. And just like we did in the front, I had those extra support pieces and I used those just to get my placement so I know that it's exactly the same spot as it is in the front one. I just clamped those together, and you can't see it off to the left of the screen. I just propped the sides of the cabinet up with some more of those support pieces. Then we can screw this in, and you can see how those dado grooves line up perfectly there on the back end for the back panel. And I'm not putting the support piece underneath on that back side, but I will be putting it next to the back panel anyway, so it will have some extra support there. But for here, we're doing that support piece in the front, and this is starting to lock it together, so it makes it a little bit more solid. And then we can go ahead and slide our panel in just like we did with the other ones. And this time I did end up deciding to put them on the ground just to make it easier on myself. And just like before, we can line up the grooves there with the support piece and then lock that back panel into place. So then we're going to be putting on the back supports just to lock everything together. And for this one, I'm kind of clamping it down to the support piece below it, because these ones had just a little slight warp to it, so I wanted to make sure everything was nice and tight together. And yes, I do go overboard sometimes with the amount of clamps I put on things just to keep things nice and tight, but it's not a bad thing in woodworking to have a little OCD sometimes, just to make sure things are as perfect as you can get them. And just like the other one, we're going to be locking it all together there with a few extra screws on the back supports. So now that we have the cabinet frames together, it's time to start cutting down the wood for the face frames. So I'm just going to be using some poplar board for this. And so we cut it down to the rough lengths, and then we can rip them down to the width that we need. And the bottom ones are going to be thicker because it's going to cover up that whole lower support piece on both of the different cabinet types. And then we'll need the thinner strips that we're cutting here for the rest of the face frames. After I get it cut to the size that I need, I always like just to do a quick little dry fit on the cabinet just to make sure it is going to look right. And I did make these just slightly wide because we're going to end up flush trimming the ends of it afterwards, so it makes it a little easier with installation. And we will be doing pocket hole screws to put these all together as well. And I checked just to make sure everything was nice and square putting together. And then since it was coming in pretty good, we can go ahead and glue them all and then just screw it all in place. Then we can, this one will flip around and do the same thing on the top. You just make sure that everything is nice and lined up, and then put in the pocket hole screws and make sure you're using the right size, because the first one I did, I ended up doing a too long one on accident and it blew through, which I was able to just kind of putty up. So here I cut down 2 spacers, and those are just going to be used on all of these face frames just to make sure that my spacing in between the face frame for the drawers are nice and equal. So I used that on the bottom part, and then I flipped it around and put those spacers from the top, and that gives me a perfect alignment. And I did check as well just to make sure my spacing was fine, and there was just about a 1/32 difference for that middle section, but that wasn't enough to make a big difference, so that worked out well. And then of course we did that once, and we're going to repeat it again. And we do the face frame the same for the other cabinets, except for it won't have the middle sections. It's just going to have that outer frame. It'll look just like this for the ones with the cabinet doors. So once we have them together, we can go ahead and give them a nice light sanding, and I end up just hitting all those edges just slightly by hand too, just to soften them up a little bit. So now we can go ahead and glue and connect these pieces to the cabinets themselves. So I lay them down on edge, do a healthy dose of glue and smear it all around, then go ahead and put those on. And for this one, since it's just going to be painted, we're just going to go ahead and attach them with a bunch of brad nails, and then after we do that, we can come back with some wood filler and fill in those holes so you'll never see them once it comes time for the paint. And of course, you want to be really careful with your placement of these just to make sure you don't blow out the sides or anything and create extra work for yourself. Now this one edge was a little bit off, so I used this extra clamp just to kind of persuade it to get a little bit more straight, and then once we glued and nailed that into place, it stayed nice. So now we have all 4 cabinet boxes all put together. I'm going to be doing the undermount slides here, so I cut out 2 extra pieces that I'll just put in front. And then you just basically draw out the edges, so that's going to get transfer your placement for them for the back. And you do one on the left, one on the right, and of course mark them, that way you don't mix up which ones are which. So then you have those lines and you do 3/8 of an offset over to the side, and that's going to be exactly where you're going to put in the back support pieces for the undermount slides. And this makes it so much easier than trying to do it while it's in the cabinet. So if you just do a little extra prep work beforehand, then it's going to go much smoother. So you can see there, we just line up the side and the bottom with the lines and those little extra marks that we made. Then you can screw those into place and do that for all 3 of the drawers on both sides. Then once you have that done, you just put those back into the cabinet where they were on each side, and then just screw them into place into those nailer pieces we put previously, and that's going to hold all of the cabinet drawers nice and secure in there. And so now we're going to go ahead and just put those slides in. You just slide them into those back support pieces and just rest them on the face frames, and that's pretty much it. It makes them really easy to install these slides, and these are probably my favorite slides to use. Now, I do like to back set them a little bit, and it just helps the face of the drawer sit nice and flush on there. I do about 1/8 back there. You can just eyeball it, to be honest, but got a little OCD on there, and so I used the combination square just to make sure everything was completely even. And then just you can do a single screw to lock it in. And then you can use that measurement later on, which we'll be doing in the next episode, to make the drawers. So to continue wrapping up the end pieces here on the cabinets. For the cabinets with the doors on them, we'll be putting in some shelves in the middle, and I wasn't quite sure exactly where I wanted it to be, and I figured I wanted a little flexibility. So we're just going to be drilling some holes here with this jig, and then we can use the pins to give a little bit of options of where we're going to put our drawers. Next up for the inside, and we're going to be doing some wipe-on polyurethane, and for this one I did a mixture of regular polyurethane with some water, and we did a 60-40 mix, and that made it really smooth to apply and wipe on. It went on a lot better than the regular pre-made wipe-on polyurethane that I used in the past, so I'm definitely going to be sticking with this going forward. And of course, the supervisor was there just to check my progress. And I do want to mention for this part, I didn't put on the face frames on these ones yet because I wanted to do this part first. And I just figured doing the extra steps and the finishing on the inside would be easier without the face frame getting in the way. But with that done, we can get to putting those on just like we did before with glue and brad nails. And then after that, we can go ahead and flush trim the edges there. And I do have a scrap piece clamped to the edge just to make sure that I don't have any blowout while I'm doing this. So then I do a quick little sanding, and then the last part to get these edges good is this putty. You just kind of mix it together and you just smear it into the edges, and it dries really hard, and it has a really good strong bond, and it'll make that totally disappear once you paint it. And I found that this just gives me better results than like a typical wood filler would. With those, I tend to see the line just a little bit. So once it's dried up, just go ahead and sand it down, and that's pretty much ready. And you can see there I'm not being very careful. I even went through the plywood veneer, but it doesn't really matter for this. And the last bit that I wanted to do before painting was to get this hole cut out. Now I put down the painter's tape, and I'm just going to go partially through it from the outside and then again through the inside, and that scores both of the plywood surfaces. That way, once I do finally go through the whole thing, I don't get any blowout on either side, and you get a nice clean edge. And the reason why we're doing this is because I want to run some power that you can access through outside the cabinets. So basically I'll cut a hole in the back of the cabinets later, and then we're just going to go ahead and put this grommet in that we got and plug that in, and so then you can access some plugs and USB ports. So at this point we have 2 cabinets that are ready for paint. And we'll be going over that next episode, as well as making the cabinet doors, drawers, and the hardware for all of that. So if you're curious for the tools or supplies that we're using, I do have links in the description below, so check that out if you're interested. If not, come back next time and we'll be moving on with the build. See you guys then.